to the season opener. This is kicking off the Education Clinic Committee season opener roundtable event. Obviously, we got Bill Belcourt, Mr. Jordan Newton. And the first thing I want to ask is raise of hands, who's a P2 in here? All right, 60% maybe. Who's a P3? All right, and who's P4? Cool, so we've got the right audience. That's kind of what we're looking to speak to. Today's going to be about, safely moving into mountain sites. And for the P2s, it's going to be about moving from point of the mountain, which has its own intricacies, to the mountain sites. And in communities that don't have ridge soaring sites, that's built into the education. But here, the questions that we get are sometimes very odd when we're bringing mentees into mountain sites. So we saw that as a gap, and we're here to do a roundtable with two of the very best experts, in the world. I don't know if you guys want to do some introductions.
I'd rather not.
I mean, I'll intro. I'm a P4 of 2 years. I've been flying 5 years. And my progression was incredibly slow the first 3 years of my flying career. I had really no access to mountain, forecasting or the kind of group chats that we have going these days where we can crowdsource information and safe days. So my whole starting career of paragliding was really just spent at Point of the Mountain and calm air mountain sledders off various sites and ridges. But I had the craving to get into cross country as I approached the sport, but I really quickly figured out that I had a lot of fear with paragliding in general. So I volunteered my time with the cross country senders. Arash kind of came in and swooped me up quick, and I drove.
David's landing in. Yeah.
Is it white?
He said he was going.
David. He came from Granger.
Yeah. He's a little late. We knew that. We knew he was going to be. I watched him launch.
But he
I was
arrived
there.
in style. So
Yeah.
that's all that matters.
It's all good.
Yeah, so I mean, I volunteered my time for 2 years, 2 full cross-country seasons, driving retrieve for the big sending crew in Utah. And that is how I approached the sport and got into cross-country myself, slowly building confidence. And so over the last 2 years, I've helped Joey mentee or mentor new pilots in the mountains. And so this is Joey's way, or the, kind of our way to size up that project. It was very small. We were mentoring maybe 3 to 6 people a season. And this is a great chance for us to scale up and get this information out to the larger community. Yeah. So really, I'm honored to be here and to have been offered by Bill to sit here with him. I chased Bill on the ground for years and still chasing him in the sky.
Now you're flying my glider.
I am flying the glider. Far poorer than he flew it, but
Along with Dave flying my glider. That's another
Yeah.
so thank you for having me.
I'll introduce you if you don't want to introduce yourself.
I think I'd rather skip that one too. So I've been flying a long time. That's all, over 30 years. And paragliders, almost exclusively. I did take some hang glider lessons in '85, but I thought it was too much of a contraption for a college student to manage and store in the dorm room. So paragliding, once it became available, became it. But enough about me. The P2s, how many years and how many hours? I'd like to hear from you one at a time. Who's going to go first?
Mike, I have been about 2 years ago, and I probably have still less than 10.
2 years ago, 10 hours, P2. Okay, keep going, please.
2 years.
Yep. 2 years, 100 hours.
4 years, 160.
Excellent.
About 8 years.
6 months, 3 hours.
All right.
I know there's more.
3 years.
Right here? Cool.
Less than a year, 20.
All right.
Casual, 15 years, only 100 hours. 5 years ago.
Year and a half, maybe 10 hours.
3 years, but I got injured. I'm coming back from an injury, so I probably got like 4 years.
So you could see that there's a lot of range in the P2. The P2s with over 100 hours, is there a reason you haven't gotten your P3 yet? Just. Yeah,
It's just not important.
just not important. So, because usually your rating gives you access to more sites, and so as long as you have access, there's just no point in taking the test and upping the rating. I think Matt Dadham is still a P3 just because he hasn't bothered to take the P4 test. And I'm still a P4 because I think there's no such thing as being a master. So P5 is a master, and you should never claim mastery over something, because it just basically means you're not learning anymore because you know it all. And in this sport, you never know it all. So P3s, what's the range there? Hours.
Really low hours, only like 40, but I've got like 350 flights. A lot of those are because of south side. So when I
Yep.
go to Monroe or someplace like that, it's different.
Probably like 4.5 years old, probably like 500, 600 hours maybe, I guess. Between 700 and 150 a year. I think maybe. It's hard to keep. Yeah, sometimes. 4 years.
Yeah, about the same thing.
5 years.
100 hours.
5 years, 120 hours.
Okay, and then the P4s, I'm familiar with all you cats already, so you've been around a while. And then with the P2s, what are your ambitions? What do you hope to get out of this?
Not die.
Not getting killed on the first day is always a good thing.
Definitely agree with that. Some cross country, maybe some problem. Progression. Next thing. Snapping out. Scared or afraid of stuff. Flying the Utah mountains is incredibly unique. We are a hot, high, and dry climate, which means that our air mass is incredibly thin. That means your active piloting has to be sharper, collapses happen quicker. You come in landing faster. These things all make Utah flying in general incredibly hard, and you'll have a direct experience of this if you've flown somewhere like Columbia or Oregon or a coastal site with a nice thick air. So there are things to be very wary of in the Utah mountains, but the Wasatch is also incredibly unique because it's west facing, it's incredibly steep in its relief, and it offers some of the most spectacular beginning milk runs for P2, P3 pilots looking to get into mountain flying. We have very well-known triggers, very well-known danger sites, and it really is just about becoming familiar with those over time, step by step, thermal by thermal.
Yeah, and so with the P2s that are, either A, trying to not get killed, or B, aspiring to get into the mountains, Or C, can't be bothered with getting your P3, but you're probably already there, so especially if you've got over 100 hours. Repetition is the mother of learning. So, and hours are the key. And those with low hours, I would be working on your hours because you want managing your glider to be second nature, reflex. And you don't develop reflexes without the hours. Flying the glider is a little bit too intellectualized still when you have low hours, and you want to make it instinctive. And so through hours, things become instinct. And so I would encourage you to, if you don't have many hours, to work on getting some hours, especially if you aspire not to get killed. Because every time that glider comes out of the bag, and it's something I still tell myself, it can kill you. Or you can have a good flight. You know, what happens is up to you. And so practice, practice, practice. So if you're serious about the sport, you want to continue doing it and have fun, put in the hours. So
No other way around that.
no way around it. You know, and I said this in Red Rocks too. There's the hours and then there's the years. And you can put in a lot of hours in a given year, but it still takes 10 years of flying to have 10 years of flying experience, because it's not only the hours, it's seasonal, it's location. The more time you have in, the more variety of sites you get to fly, the more different times of the year you get to fly the changing seasons. And every year delivers, I would say, some learning experience. And like I said, I've been doing this a long time. And I would say every year I learn new things, which is what keeps me excited about the sport, is the fact that your learning is never over. And so, but you got to show up. So, and you got to be patient. And that means the expectation of a linear learning curve. That's not a curve, if you will. You need to drop that. You know, some years are going to be better than others. Some days are going to be better than others. Your friends might have breakthroughs that put them at times on a steeper curve, and don't make this comparative. Be patient, and you'll have your moments of breakthroughs as well. You got to look at the long game in this sport, and let the learning come over time, because you don't want to burn out or get sort of overwhelmed or scared by, you know, sucking from the fire hose too much. So the mind is a muscle, I like to say, like any other. And, you know, with exercise and rest, like any muscle, it can get stronger. But too much exercise, get injured. And an injury of the mind can take a lot longer to recover from than one of the body. So when you're starting out flying this year, recognize, you know, this is just like not running all winter. And it's like, oh, I got to start training because it's springtime, and I'm going to start running again. You know, are you going to start with a 10-mile run? Probably not a good idea. So you're going to, you know, work your way into it. A few short runs a week, slowly building the miles. until you get your fitness back. You got to look at flying exactly the same way. Going to get that glider out of the bag. It's been a few months. Don't go try to send a big cross-country flight if you've got that move already, because that's like going for that 10-mile run right off the couch. It can be a bit much, and so be content with shorter flights. Just take it to the point where you feel like you've had enough, and then call it. That's your short run. You're getting back into it. Be patient, work your way back into it, build your mental and physical, not just strength, but reflexes to just make a nice progressive training curve to get back into the season. And for all the P2s, especially the ones with low hours, you gotta, I would say you gotta be extra careful starting back up after a winter break because it's springtime. There's a lot of air moving around, is what I like to say. And when there's a lot of air moving around, there's more management involved. You got to pick your spots a bit more carefully. And so, be patient with where you get your hours. The point is an amazing place. One of the most unique places you'll find anywhere in the US in terms of its consistency. And other than running into solid objects or running into each other, it's a very safe place to fly. And the south side is easier to fly than the north side, but the north side is also a pretty safe place to fly and a really good place to accumulate hours before going to the mountains. A strong spring afternoon on the north side is good training, really good training. When I talk about accumulating your hours, to have those reflexes dialed and a really good feel for your wing, Point's a phenomenal place. I put in, I think, 5 years there in the early 90s before I ventured much into the mountains. And it was a great place to train.
Agreed. Yeah, I'm going to take that pause to tell you guys, this is supposed to be entirely interactive. So I want, if you have a question, raise your hand. And that's how we're going to do this.
I
So,
just want to mention, since we're talking about spring and active flying.
yep.
And getting a serious amount of time in the north side flying before you actually hit the mountains. The Point Rat series is the perfect venue for you to come out and practice a lot of these things and get a ton of hours. Come out and join the Point Rat series this year. And if you need help, we're out there for you as well.
Sure.
So who's done the Point Rat series? All right, well, all those
Anybody that wants to
hands,
fly the mountain should be involved.
yeah, all those hands that aren't up, you should talk to Neil about the Point Rat series because it's a great training tool to get, not only more hours, but really familiar with your glider because, it's competitive. You're going to have to, I would say, plan more than you've planned a typical night out on the point, and then you're going to have to push more bar than you've been pushing on a typical night out at the point. And it's something you can really get into, and it's a great training tool. I would encourage you all to do it.
But don't stress the competition too much, because one of the things that's nice about the Point Rat series is you can compete against yourself. So every time you take a flight and you upload that track, it gives you the stats for that flight, and you can compare it to the last time you did it. So it's actually a really good way to measure yourself against yourself. So don't let the competition aspect scare you away from it or say, oh, I'm not into competition, so I'm not going to do it. You don't have to be in competition, you still get a lot out of it.
Are there tasks that you perform? Download an instrument or something?
Yes. We have one task a month for 4 months out of the summer, and you can run those tasks as many times as you want all summer long.
Where do you find those tasks?
They'll be on the club website. We haven't announced the pass for 2023 yet, but we will shortly. We'll start in May, it'll end in September. They roll out month by month. And then they roll out month by month. But once you pass that period, you can still apply the ones from months past as well. And then you can still, if you are in the company, you can still use those to compete as well.
Yeah, I mean, jumping into competition flying, even in the, Point Rat series, is such a great way to become familiarized with more instrument information in the mountains than you are accustomed to flying point on the mountain. You may just have a beeping vario or no vario at all because you have the terrain to judge, if you're in lift or sink. But out in the mountains, having familiarity with glide ratio, with all the like small things from the tasks from comps. Drawing a blank now, but I mean, becoming familiarized with your instruments and all the extra information that you might not be thinking about really serves you in the mountains. Because with all that lift in the mountains comes a lot of sink, and that sink is something, if you've only flown from the mountain, will really shock you. If you're in a 4 meter per second climb, there's 4 meter per second sink right on the edge of it, and you have to push through that sink to get to lift. And so if you're not paying attention to glide ratio and speed bar use, all of which your instrument can give you an incredible amount of information for.
I have a question. Is it inappropriate to venture into the mountains without having done an SIV? Because when I'm flying turbulent air, I have pretty good kiting skills, but I feel like I don't know if my input is going to result in a cascade. Am I going to make it worse? Or am I like, is the wing better than me? Should I just go hands up? You know what I'm saying? Without having had an SIV.
Yeah, there's always going to be safe windows to venture into the mountains. This typically is going to be the first thermals of the day, right when the day turns on, and the last hour and a half to 2 hours of the night. Those thermals are generally the calmest, the edges are the least sharp. They're really great introductions into the mountain sites. But I mean, there is something to be said about having the mental model of how your glider behaves in collapse and the energy management of your glider. Until you have in your toolkit full power wing over, nose down spiral, direct exit, the correction of the angle of the glider as it shoots. Those are all things that if you understand, the scary things of the mountains become a lot less scary. Whereas, if you know how to handle a collapse, that alone is going to keep you safer in the mountains. But oftentimes what we see is that someone takes a simple collapse and misses the initial input, and it then cascades into, the next round. And that's where their mental model fails. And so that's where they hands up or trust the glider or the reserve comes out.
Yeah, so that's a really good transition into talking about when you would fly in the mountains with that experience level. And then what the importance of forecasting and understanding the intensity of the day. Maybe you guys could speak to that.
I'll answer that. I've never had an SIV, so.
We know.
Well, they didn't have them back in the day, so.
You keep your glider open.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I was alluding to, is if you're flying in a time where you're keeping your glider open, it's, yeah.
So, I don't want to just keep talking up here without hearing from the audience. So up to this point, does anyone have any questions? Something specific to your own flying experience that you have a question about?
So a thing I run into a lot is I'm not skilled enough to feel like I can push out into some of these areas on my own, but I also don't know anybody that flies really, and I have really weird schedule, so it's hard for me to fly out. So I guess, are there any ideas for how to do that? I don't feel like doing it on my own is the right answer.
Where do you fly usually?
I'm also just pointing out, I've done a few mountain sites, but always, like I took 10 Jorgensen's class, so
Yeah.
I was with the group then, but
So you've been to Inspo and,
just the one time.
yep. So, there's a Facebook group.
There's a Telegram.
There's a Telegram group, there's a Messenger group, think Wasatch Hike and Fly.
Yep.
A lot of
Um,
groups.
so there's a bunch of groups and you could sort of see where people are going. And then people aren't going unless they think it's good. So you got that going for you. And then just show up. So 50% of this sport is just showing up. You don't have to fly, but if you don't show up, there'll be no option to fly. So show up, and if you're not comfortable with flying, Arash is always looking for drivers, and so at least you could sort of get in. If you do some driving, you'll get an idea of who the crew is, what kind of conditions they're looking for, what sites they go to, based on conditions. It sort of breaks the ice, if you will, on getting in with a motivated crew that is going to take advantage of the good days. Because I often say with this sport, it's the company you keep. And if you get in with a good group, you know, you learn a lot. If you get in with a not so good group, not so much.
Can I say, I want Jordan to expound on that in a second, like we talked about in the agenda, but also Josh is setting up a Telegram for site intros to sites that maybe you haven't been to before, or you want to talk about that real quick?
Yeah.
Hold on, wait, we have one more question.
Go ahead.
So I just like getting that, I guess, from like mountain to mountain flying, it's like the knowledge gap. Like, I feel like I had a lot, you know, given to me during training about flying the mountain, and I've just kind of like patched together stuff about mountain flying from people that I've met or friends in the community. But is there like a good way to like bridge that gap in knowledge? Because I don't want to just go into the mountains kind of blindly following people and without having like my own, you know, does that make sense? Like, I don't know how to bridge that gap. Is there any resources?
Well, before Jordan goes, because him and Joey and others have been mentoring people across that gap.
Yep.
You know, there's also the instructor community, whether it's Dale Covington or whether it's Ken. You can certainly take a mountain flying course as a way to help bridge the gap if you want something more formal, or you can hook up with these two for something less formal, but still really good on getting you across the gap. So
Yeah,
over to you.
I mean, the gap is so difficult. I spent years stressed about crossing that gap, and I instead chose to drive retrieve for years rather than actually taking that gap. What we talked to in our mentor group is, or at least the culture we try to build is, first, we stress the importance of forecasting. And this forecasting for mountains is certainly different than forecasting for Point of the Mountain. You know, if there's sun and it's north, or there's sun and there's south, Point of the Mountain is going to generally work. Whereas the mountains, you start looking for a lot more complex things like instability and, you know, the list goes on. So learning how to forecast and then doing your own forecasting for the day at whatever depth you can, and showing up to your mentors or your friends or the community that is going to those mountain sites and taking the initiative, saying, hey, I've looked at the day, I've done this amount of forecasting, here are my thoughts on the day. What are you all thinking? And then you get that dialogue of someone saying, you know, here's my forecast, here's my forecast, here's my forecast, you know, breakdown conclusion. And that is such a great way over time to learn how to forecast better, which bridges the gap because, you know, it's certainly flyable a lot of days. It's flyable when we have east wind here. Do I enjoy flying on east wind days? I really don't. And I've just learned that over time. So I look for a very specific type of forecast, and that gets me excited. And so I show up.
Yeah, so I wanted to add something on the forecasting thing, because a lot of people think of forecasting like strength of thermals and wind. And what Jordan's really trying to talk about is, like, as a P2 coming to a new site, as mentors, we like to see the P2 say, this is why I think it's good for me to fly today. This is the time frame, and I think it's going to be relatively calm and normal, or whatever normal is for you, because of X, Y, and Z, and then allowing them to mirror back to you. So that's what Jordan's trying to talk about there.
And, you know, and we sat down with our mentees and we showed them how to use XC skies and we show them how to compare over with the soaring forecasts and how to use these tools. And they're complex. And we do have a weather clinic coming up. There'll be a sign up here for that. And that is such a great way to bridge the gap, is just with increasing your knowledge in forecasting. At least then you at least have the mental knowledge of
Yeah.
why you're choosing to show up to that site. And it's because you're hopeful. You're hopeful that that day is going to be good for you at some point in the flying window, earlier or later.
Yeah, and both of these questions are asking about how to bridge the gap, and that's what the roundtable is trying to do. And then we're going to be running 10 to 15 clinics this year, including Josh's site intro clinics. And he has a list of sites that he'll be bringing appropriate pilots to help them understand what the site specific issues are. And then we'll be doing weather clinics, another roundtable, a reserve clinic. We're going to host a wilderness first aid, a couple other things. So
there's bridging the gap, and there's managing how big the gap is. And so if you're gonna go from going, all right, I've got a bunch of hours flying the north side when it's on. Now I'm gonna go over to the V or Grandeur, and I'm gonna fly Grandeur when it's on. Could be a big gap. And so how do we make the gap smaller? All right, I'm gonna go over to Grandeur and I'm gonna launch early. And I might not stay up, but at least I'll get a good launch and a good landing in the LZ. And maybe I'll be able to maintain, but I might be not thermaling out. So I'm going to minimize the gap by launching early and not worrying about staying up, so I can familiarize myself with the site, launching, and familiarize myself with the landing zone. And so you could take the edge off by having a few sledders before you start looking for more on conditions and thermaling at the site. And so I've seen too many people show up at a mountain site without a lot of mountain hours, and it's on, and they don't get hurt, but I would say maybe not having a great time either. And so you want to manage the gap, and when in doubt, make the gap smaller. And that also could mean waiting until, just like many nights at the point, you wait until it calms down a bit before you go. And so if you're at a mountain site and it feels like it's on and people are getting ripped out of there, just be like, all right, I'm going to wait until later, do some para waiting until it settles down where I have a mellower flight, because I want the gap to be small.
I mean, learning through passive absorption has been incredibly helpful for me. I stood on countless dozens of mountain launches, never flying, but standing there with the people who were flying, listening to them talk about the cycle timing, which is a huge part in the mountains, talking about why the cycle is coming up the mountain slope where the wind isn't, you know, all these like weird things you would never think about. And just standing around these pilots, waiting for them to launch at 10 a.m. for a 10-hour flight. I absorbed so much real world experience by listening and watching and not flying, which is why it took me a long time to get into mountain flying in general, is I just really needed to understand how the mountains work. And I did that through a lot of passive absorption. I drove a lot of retrieve. I stood on a lot of mountain sites, and I have bombed out so many times, especially last spring when I was really trying to send hard. But yeah, you know, becoming a mentee and finding a mentor is incredibly difficult. It's a two-way road. The mentor sacrifices and the mentee sacrifices. So making friends, showing up, and really trying to contribute something. You know, if that's showing up on Grandeur, which, you know, it's just a 1,200-foot hike on a day that's too spicy for you, but you help fluff wings or just kind of stand around asking questions. I would certainly welcome that. I'm really chatty on launch, especially beforehand, talking about conditions and sharing information. Josh always launches last of the group to get people off the hill safely. And so being on launch with the people who are flying the flights that you aspire to fly is such a great idea. That is such a great investment of your time, whether you fly or not.
And so another way you manage the gap when you are launching in stronger conditions is I never pull up in something just because it looks like a really good cycle. I want to make sure I can get a good launch. So that's the priority over a really good cycle, because a really good cycle might be going, I don't want to get plucked. I'm not going to pull up in this. You know, I'll wait till the backside of it before I pull up, even if I risk sinking out. If the launch is tall enough, I'm usually confident I'll find something else. But the first priority is to have a good launch. So you're you're sort of micromanaging it there. And then if it's strong, am I thermaling close to the hill? No, going out front more, just because I feel like I need more room. So you're managing that mountain site. And so if you're new to a mountain site, move out into the valley. And, you know, it's one of those transitions. And I did the same thing when I left the point and went into the mountains. Hell, back in the day when Chris Santa Cruz was 16 years old, I watched him, you know, struggle to transition from the point to the mountains, and he broke his arm, ridge soaring inspo, too close. Flying it like it was the south side, because that's all we knew. And so when we got into the mountains, you know, our instincts were to ridge soar. And I even see it today with pilots transitioning from the point to the mountains. They're launching in a bit too much wind for the mountains, because you can handle a lot more wind at the point. And then they're usually flying a bit too close to the terrain because the point's all they knew. And this is the style of flying that they're needing to break free from when they get into the mountains, and that takes time. And you find that when you're mountain flying, moving out actually works better than staying in tight. The thermals aren't compressed and distorted against the terrain. They're a little bit more formed and easier to stay in when you're out front. And then at the same time, you're more comfortable out there. And so you can focus more on turning in the thermal. And you know, those are small tools you can use to help bridge the gap between flying the point and flying the mountains. And then mentally know that when you fly the mountains, it's going to be a different approach than you would fly at the point. And you're going to have to give yourself the time and the space to adapt to it. It takes time. And so that repetition being the mother of learning again, even if, like I said, even if it's just hike and fly style sledders, you still need a good launch, a good landing in an unfamiliar place. So there's a lot to learn from that.
Yeah, we had on our list of topics that it is incredibly important, especially as a P2 who has never stepped into the mountain flying, to really ensure that you have the knowledge that you need to build a whole new framework for how to fly in the mountains. This is exactly what you were talking about, Bill. You know, you spent however many hundreds of hours or dozens of hours building this framework for how to fly a paraglider in a ridge site. And the mechanics of that usually don't work in the mountains. And so you really have to spend the time, however long that is, building this whole new mental framework on how and why the mountains are working. parcels of air and reservoir catches and lee side flying trigger sites, all these things. Less wind is better generally. A lot of things are very opposite from ridge site soaring. And so if you feel like you don't know or you don't have a framework for the mountains, those are questions to start, formulating and asking mentors, instructors, friends. You have to build them.
Yeah, so that brings up an interesting topic. One of the biggest things that's different from the point of the mountain to like Grandeur or the Y or any of those hike up sites is that you got to be prepared for that. I know you can speak to that pretty well. A lot of our P2s have never hiked up a 40-pound pack. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's the physical side of hiking up a 40-pound pack, 1,200 feet or 2,400 feet. Usually want to give yourself a whole bunch of extra time. You are usually fairly worked by the time you get to the top, on top of then having to set up your gear, all simultaneously paying attention to the cycle pattern and trying to get a pulse on what's going to actually occur when you take off. A big thing that really stood in my way for a long time was bad landings in the mountains. And this was happening to me in non-thermic conditions because I was so used to landing at the point of the mountain with tons of break. You have so much wind that you can really just kind of float down, levitate down, come in with min sync, and have a really soft landing. And especially when you're landing in unfamiliar LZ, you are fairly gripped. And that fear manifests, at least in me in my early years, as tension in the brakes. And so I took a lot of hard landings, like a lot. And it took mentorship for me to really understand that if you are landing downwind, in sync, or in nil wind in the mountain sites, you have to land with energy. You have to really come in with more speed than you think you want to, and plane the energy out so you have flare authority. And that is really intimidating when you are coming at the ground fast. And the only way to do that is starting on the edges and working your way in towards it. Going up and doing more hike and flies with your full size kit. Trying to, maybe land an LZ you're not familiar with. But you're trying to make those landings really soft, because if you fail to manage that energy in sinking air or an unsuspected downwind landing, those are really hard landings. Really, really hard.
So more challenges facing the P2s. Personal experience from P2s out there, some of the challenges you're facing.
Talking about launching when the thermals are starting, when they're starting to die down. So what if when you're launching, you're progressing closer and closer to that prime time, right? Basically. So on the earlier side, you launch and catch the thermal. And by the time you're ready to come down, it's real thermal. What do you do?
Well, you're gonna just have to deal with it. Because there you are. And it'll happen to you. It's just like, man, it's kind of on. I wish I was down, but I'm not. And so now I just got to get them.
Find the sink.
Yeah, in the beauty of the beauty of thermal flying is there's not always a thermal. And so, but there's always one when you don't want it. And never one when you want it. That's just, that's just the laws of physics. So, so you just have to be patient and you'll find your spot to get down. And so if it's, here you are setting up and it's looking pretty good, and then all of a sudden the thermal rips off and your total, your approach is blown, because now it's like, and it's like, okay, let's just go around again. Or now I'm just gonna lazily turn in this thermal and take another shot at setting up a landing, or I'm gonna wait until the thermal's gone and then I'm gonna take another shot. And then it's You're hoping that another one doesn't happen just when you're setting up the next one, but it might happen as well too. I would say just don't feel like it's an emergency. Even if it's taken you a while to get down and the day is even becoming more there's no need for extreme measures. You'll find a window and you'll be able to land. You could be on a cross-country flight out in the middle of Wyoming in the middle of the day, and it's 110 degrees, and cloud base is at 20,000 feet, and you could still sink out in the middle of the day because the gap between thermals based on timing was
Insurmountable.
and so you land. And so that'll even happen on the best days. And so that means that on any given day there'll be a time to land. And the first time you go to a competition, you'll see 150 pilots landing in some hot LZ in the middle of the day because that's gold. I would say pilots of all skill levels on all types of gliders can pull it off. And so just be confident. You may not like it, but you're going to solve it and it'll be fine.
Yeah, I would like to add to that. It's for the P2 site introductions, we typically will launch people in the evenings so that you don't have to worry about them feeling like they're in over their head and then getting a fear injury. So, especially on our west facing terrain.
So I had exactly that experience as a learning event when I was in Mexico this last January. I'd flown Monroe. This was my big other sort of different kind of site. So I was soaking up so much new stuff. One day we launched at the normal time. If we would have done a little, short casting down, it would have been no big deal. But following our mentor instructor there, and he was taking us around, and we ended up getting more into the middle of the day, into much more dicey stuff. Fortunately, at that site, there were landing spots all over the place. This field, that field, so it was fairly safe learning experience. But what you just said there in terms of being patient, we had to be patient for me and another guy, similar level, where we're both early-ish P3s, and we just went around and around, and he'd go that way looking for zinc, and I'd go this way, and he's going down, so I'd head over there. By the time I got there, it was going up. And I said the phrase, "Oh, come on," probably 50 times, because every time I thought I was going down, dang, I went up. Too bumpy for big ears, but my big takeaway for that whole thing that I could learn here at the point is more rapid descent techniques. Learning from all the experts, not the crazy nasty stuff, but gradually get more stuff in my quiver so that I could try some of those other things to come down, rather than waiting for 45 minutes to find enough sink to get on the ground.
It's more important to add, if you guys don't mind. As Bill said, sometimes you're up there, you're kind of stuck. Your mind starts to race. When I was a new P2, I still remember the first time I got stuck up, if you will. And I was like absolutely losing my mind. I think rounding strategies, no pun intended, are important. Things you can, breathing techniques, other little measures you can take to remain calm. It's like Bill says, eventually you're going to find your way down. But like you said, it might be a second. So maintaining your mind is very important in these moments, because mental sharpness is important in all of these scenarios.
Yeah, at the end of the day, when it starts to get dark, you'll come down.
Sometimes.
Almost
Yeah.
like a cove.
Unless it's glass off a king, and then you're not coming down. So
I mean, talking about big ears and rowdy
you got
air.
one.
Gets you far away from the sites. And you talk about being and time site, so that you are less likely to take flash during the thermal, the thermal launcher.
Yeah, and this is something that, well, when the thermal first comes through launch, might be a dust devil on the front of it. And so I usually like to wait until it fills in, whatever you want to call that term, or turbulent part, especially if it's a strong cycle, is usually when it first gets there. And then I also like to wait if I don't quite know where the peak, where the peaks are yet. And so, because peak can be bigger than you think. And so you want to have an understanding for what the rhythm of that time of day is and what the peaks are going to be like. So you're not launching in something that is going to have a peak far higher than you expected. And now your feet are going to be off the ground. You're just going to have to deal with it. And so just wait for it to clean up before you pull up into it. And make sure that, when you first get into the air, you're feeling the brakes. You're not letting them go to get into your harness or, futz with your instruments. You got to just make sure you're, it could be a habit you can get into from the point is that once you're out away from launch, as long as you're not going to run into anybody, you can do whatever, which is kind of true. But in the mountains, you could get a sharper edge that you could get a collapse from. And so just make sure when you're in that transition from the ground to getting established in the air and getting away from the hill, you're giving that glider your full attention.
Yeah, the point
A
to
couple of times last year, I took some big class, just getting on the way. And once it was like right at the Y, very steep. I'd bring it up and immediately take a huge class.
So,
And so one half my lane, it's just like.
well, yeah, and I would say that that has less to do with the air that you're launching in and more to do with getting a better feel for your wing. Because if you, yeah,
It was a bad joke for calling mine. But I have noticed at times that there are some turbulent edges to those thermals. How we're
yeah, and I would say, and this is why I joke about the SIV. The SIV is about the cure, not about the prevention. And it's really hard to teach the prevention, which is glider management. And if you put in the hours, you notice that the amount of collapses you get diminish greatly. In fact, I can sort of list them over the past decade. And there's probably, like 3 of significance, ranging mostly CCC or open class wings. But on a D wing, I'll pretty much never have anything but maybe a tip. And and all I'm doing is just managing the glider. It's all I'm ever doing. And so, I tell people that are having a lot of collapses is work on their glider management, or have their glider checked. It's an old glider, or even if it's a new glider, because mistakes get made. And if you're getting a lot of collapses, something's wrong. It's either you or it's the glider, or I would say a distant third would be the conditions that you're flying in, flying conditions that can overwhelm the glider, which also means where you're flying the glider. Were you in the lee side, were you in a canyon or venturi of some kind? But if you're getting a lot of wax, something's wrong.
One thing to consider with our mountain sites is that this is true for the Y, this is true for Grandeur, Upper Launch, and a few others for sure, is that the thermal is out front away from the hill. So when you launch off of the mountain to enter the thermal, you are oftentimes launching into the backside or lee of the thermal, which is always the more rowdy side, the downwind side of the thermal. And so knowing in your mental model that when I launch, I need to push straight away from the hill, get through the rowdy lee side of that thermal into the more windward clean amalgamated portion of the thermal is something I'm thinking about. You know, if you're launching and you feel it's really, it requires sharp handling and it feels turbulent and pitchy, it's likely because you're on the backside of that thermal still, which adds a danger in launching mountains in general, is that you have to get through the lee of the thermal into the more windward side away from terrain.
Yeah, and on glider management, you're not up there preventing collapses. You're up there maintaining pressure, and you're keeping the glider in, the right zone over your head. And it's like, it's not getting back here because you're giving it too much. It's not getting out here because you're not giving it enough. You don't have to keep it exactly right there. You just sort of want to keep it in this general zone. This includes this. And if you're maintaining the pressure and sort of keeping the glider where it belongs, the glider will take care of everything else. And so, and you're trying to be smooth, you're not stabbing at it. But, in active air, if you see a glider flying in active air and it's a good pilot, doesn't seem like it's doing anything and conditions look really nice. If you zoomed in on the pilot, you would see that there was a lot of movement to keep the glider at the right pressure in the right spot. And so, that's what you're looking for. You're trying to be smooth, and you're trying to be, in tune with the glider, that one with the glider, which means that you're not even really thinking about it. You've got enough hours in where it's just instinctive, it's just reflexive. Your body is, is managing the glider without having your mind have to be involved all that much. And that's the state that you're looking to achieve, and you achieve that through putting in the time.
One thing I had to add is, at least in our mentor group, when we saw new pilots in the mountains, they would start their active piloting by adding pressure, finding pressure. Then after finding the pressure, they were failing to bring speed back to the glider. I think that a faster glider through turbulence is generally safer. By slowing your glider down in turbulence, you're almost welcoming that collapse. So, not only just catching those collapses with catching pressure in your brakes, or with a drop in the weight shift, but also then reminding yourself to return up to speed and let that glider keep punching through that, like through the turbulence. Just riding deep in the brakes and active piloting from a depth in the brakes decreases how much brake you have to pull to meet a deeper decompression of the wing. So catch the pressure, catch the collapse, keep the glider overhead, and then return the hands up to a point where your glider has speed to cut through the turbulence.
So before that question, I'll just say, give you an exercise to do, especially for the P2s looking to gain some hours. You can learn a lot by standing on the ground at the lip of the south side, kiting your glider on a light day. Because on a windy day, or a windier day, you can kind of stand there pretty easily. But on a lighter day where you've got maybe a little bit of ridge lift and then you've got some thermals coming through as well, you're going to lose the glider if you're into the brakes too deep, because it's going to start to fall behind you and you're just getting off the brakes, hoping there's going to be enough air to hold it up there. So it's going to make you get off the brakes in order to have the glider not fall behind you. And then when a little thermal comes in, that glider is going to want to surge forward and bite into that thermal, and you're going to have to hold it back in order to stay on the ground. And then if you've got people ridge soaring in front of you, sending a wake at you, you're going to have to give just the right amount of input to prevent a frontal, which It's a lot easier now than it used to be because gliders have gotten better. But still, especially if it's a tandem. And if you give it too much, if you don't give it enough input, you're getting it full on. If you give it too much input, glider's just going to drop back behind you and you're going to have to start over. And so that exercise is basically what it's like to be in the air, and why just not going, as Jordan says, to a static position in the brakes is necessary, because you're going to need to give it more brakes sometimes and less brakes sometimes as you manage where the glider is. And also when you're landing in an unfamiliar spot, as Jordan said earlier, not being too deep in the brakes is important, because if you're deep in the brakes, landing behind a line of trees, as soon as you get into that grading where the trees surrounding an LZ will start to block the winds, you can easily stall the glider. Just by doing nothing more than holding the brakes, we would say at min sync and dropping through a gradient, the glider can just spin them. Usually won't stall, but usually always spin. And people have been surprised by it. So being hands up, coming into an unfamiliar landing zone, especially one with obstacles, the little extra speed is your friend. You'll just have to set yourself up, for a slightly longer approach, because the glider is flying a little faster. And that is another habit you'll have to break on from flying at the point, because it's a very forgiving place for launches, for landing, for the amount of wind you can tolerate, for how close to the terrain you can be, and there'll be habits to break, and we've all had to break that made the transition. Just be patient with yourself, and give yourself plenty of room. That's what I was telling you. But you had a question.
You mentioned two things that sounded related. The value of speed and turbulence, and then you started to mention something about big ears.
Oh, right. For new pilots for P2, at least this was like on the descent techniques. When you pull big ears, as long as you're not afraid of being blown back somewhere, because that would increase drag, pulling big ears increases the loading on your glider, which prevents it from collapse. You will generally kind of get like oscillated a little bit more because you'll have less directional control. But big ears plus a little bit of speed bar and turbulent air is one of the safest descent techniques for a new pilot, even if it's super, super active and rowdy. Especially half bar, big ears, and then pulling bar, pushing bar, half bar, full bar, whatever you're comfortable with. With that high loading, you're just so unlikely to collapse from that position. So it does feel like you have less control, but that will absolutely keep you at least at a similar elevation to where you're at in lifting air. If you can't find lift and you really don't want to go up, big ears and half bar, or big ears and full bar, quarter bar, is such a great tool in rowdy air to maintain elevation, or to drop quick if you need to drop quick. But yeah, I mean, flying in the mountains, one of the biggest shocks to me was how much I use speed bar. Speed bar to enter a thermal, sometimes speed bar to exit a thermal, full speed bar within the thermal to find the better pieces. I am using speed bar all day long, and that just comes with familiarity and I guess building that mental model. There are risks with speed bar like anything else, but mostly it's a tool, and it is very much required for active piloting in strong air. So
I wanted to talk about that. So talk about using speed bar in better conditions and kind of away from when you see speed bar.
sure.
Like expected, expected B was there on the A.
Probably lots of A's and B's in this room. Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, can you restate that one? Because I think we had a hard time hearing over here.
Yeah. The use of speed bar in active air on A's and B's. And how to avoid collapses on speed bar. So when you press bar, your foot becomes your first data point for an upcoming depressurization of your wing. So rather than your seat board, rather than your hands, it becomes your foot. So you've applied bar, you're flying through turbulent air, and you suddenly feel a depressurization. That will be the pressure in your foot on your bar will drop first. So your first input on bar is to actually just drop bar. It adds pressure immediately. So developing sensitivity in rowdy air, being on bar, feeling the depressurization happen on your foot first, then it happens on your seat board, then it happens on risers, then it happens on brakes, goes in reverse order. Becoming cognizant of those signals being sent to you allows you to catch those collapses quicker. And you usually catch it by coming off bar suddenly, either a portion or a full release of bar. With speed bar and A's and B's, the high B's these days have rear risers, BC controls, which are incredible. You generally don't want to be on bar, on full bar with a ton of brake usage. A's will forgive that and low B's will forgive that. And most high B's should forgive it as well. But anywhere C+, if you are on full bar and you pull brakes, you're very prone to a collapse as you've increased the angle of attack and then you suddenly deflect the trailing edge. It usually ends up in a depressurization in a frontal or an ascent collapse. So at least in terms of preventing a collapse while on bar, pay attention to the pressure in your foot. And if you feel that depressurization, the bar is never static, just like your brake usage. You're always fluttering the bar on, off, on, off, on, off. And that alone pressurizes the wing before even needing brakes. So, does that answer your question, boss?
More questions?
How about speed bar during flight from gliding, from glide ratio to increase your glide ratio or decrease your sink rate?
How much bar you use, it depends on the day. And that is, am I going downwinds? All right, going downwinds. It might be better just to fly the glider at trim and I don't have to give it much bar. If I'm going upwinds, you have to be on the bar all the time if you want to get anywhere. Just because your glide ratio is going to be so bad between thermals. If you get yourself in a bad spot, and this is when you're new to cross country flying, even if you've read about, Venturis at the mouths of canyons in books, they can be pretty much a non-event one day and really bad another day. And so you can find yourself going, oh, I crossed from Cascade to Tim the other day deep and it worked great. And today it didn't work good at all. I'm going down in Provo Canyon. And so I'm on bar trying to make up for my error. And I need a lot of bar to get out of here. And the air doesn't feel that great, but I kind of have no choice but to stay on it because I want to get out of here. And so those situations, you don't have the luxury of getting off the bar when it starts to feel weird. You're just going to be on it all the time and kind of dealing with it. And that can be education. Mostly don't go into the canyon deep. Give it a wide berth. Always give them a wide berth. So it'll depend, upwind, downwinds. Is it the beginning of the day where the thermals are weak? And so I don't want to increase my sink rate. So I'm going to be conservative on the bar because I know my sink rate goes up the more bar I use. Is it in the middle of the day? And now there's clouds and thermals everywhere where I can just throttle the thing and not even worry about my sink rate so much because the thermals are abundant. Or is it the end of the day where things are getting weaker again and I'm better served with half bar or less just because I want a little better sink.
I wanted to add, I think for the P2s, Biggest thing about speed bar is getting familiar and comfortable with it. It's not scary at all. And then using it to escape sink. Yeah. So,
Yeah, and then using it to escape sink, I kind of find that more theoretical than anything else, because it just seems, you could look at the, McCrady's speed to fly, or look at the polar curve root glider and do the math on, if it's 1,000 down and I get a 5-to-1 on full bar, how far I can go before I hit the ground versus, just being in it longer at a lower sink rate. So yeah, you sort of stick with the theory is the more sink you're in, you apply more bar, which means your glider goes like shit and sinks even faster while you're in the strong sink. And that's supposed to be better than flying with less. So you're going down like a rock either way. And you have to trust the math. And so I would say that if the math says more bar is better in sink, then trust the math. But the answer might be diverting off the line you're on might be a better answer than more bar.
Like a lateral move.
45-degree change in direction might be a better solution than just more speed.
I mean, from thermal, go ahead.
Let's get out of the sink.
Get out of the sink.
Better than maintaining your.
Yeah, and I don't, as long as I'm headed for another trigger, and in the Wasatch, you're just flying from spine to spine. So if another trigger is within reach, then you can just put the bar on and get there as quickly as possible. But if you're flying the flats, depending on how much altitude you have, you might not decide that just more bar on the line you're on is the best solution. And maybe it's a 90-degree course correction is going to get you a better result than hoping you can get to the end of the sink with more bar.
That makes sense.
I mean, if you can find a line that's 2.5 meters a second sink for the duration of your glide versus 3.5 meters a second sink, you come into that next thermal higher in the thermal, more conglomerated, higher chance to climb out, less of a low save.
So if you have the opportunity to fly with other pilots, always be seeing if they're getting a better glide than you. And if they are, you just adjust your line towards them. Or if they're really falling off the cliff, you just adjust your line away from them. And I find that it can make a huge difference. Just adjusting your line away from them.
Comp flying teaches you that really well. Generally with weight shift, changing your line. The more brake you use to change your line, the more height you lose. So if you can change your line by weight shift and do it gradually, that could be a smart move.
But if they're falling off the cliff, pull them. Right?
Yeah, get away from that line for sure.
Yeah, changing the topic a little bit, what goes through your mind, or what's your mental process planning bailouts, both for the flight and you end up someplace you didn't expect to be during the flight? How do you, what's a good way to go about it?
Well, you start trying to fly from the V to the point in the wintertime. And you're low all the time. And so you're really paying attention to the bailouts. Because you're low all the time. And so you're with a bailout, you're just, while you're scratching along, you're looking around going, okay, what are my options? I'm always asking myself what my options are. It's like, okay, I got to park there, I got a school there. But when you have to just not care if the school's in session, because it is, you might not ever use it as a bailout, but you would be remiss to not put it on the list as you're going along, because if you need it, you need it. And you can just apologize after. It's better than, you know, landing in a tree or in a power line or crashing into someone's roof. So whatever is a viable option is going to be on the list when you roll. And so you're just making sure you've got one or two within reach at all times. And so, and if you don't, and if you've got one or two within reach, I'm not moving on unless I feel like I can get another one or two within reach. And so because you're going, okay, you know, and this was a flight this past winter, it's like, I got one or two within reach and there's some bubbles around here. I'm low, I'm not leaving these one or two. I'm going to work these bubbles and see if I can find some lift. And then you find some lift. And then that allows you to move along to another one or two until you're high enough where it's no longer the first of mind. And so when you're low, you know, your options are first of mind. You know, and then when you're in that middle range, it's not as critical, but you know, you might still be looking for them. And then when you're high, you know, it's down the list of priorities, thank God. So so that's what I would always be doing in flight. And paragliders fly slow, so you know, hillside landings are you know, are something that's easily achievable. And when Jordan was talking earlier about, you know, sinking out a lot, I remember someone saying to me at Inspo, man, you never sink out. How do you do it? And I'm like, see all those little hills out there? Because there's a lot of little hills out there. At least there used to be more of them. I've landed on the side of every single one of them. And every possible gully to, you know, that you could stuff a paraglider into, I've stuffed them into there too. And eventually, you know, you learn how to climb out. But, you know, that's part of the game, you know, and that comes from going, all right, I know you can stuff these things in anywhere. And so that's one of the advantages of flying a paraglider is the fact that you can stuff it in anywhere. And be confident enough in your skills as you build them that, you know, you can use your skills to land in small spots, and putting into the scrub oaks isn't the end of the world either. I picked my glider out of plenty of scrub oaks. So is Joe. So is Jordan.
I definitely have.
And it's all fun. So but always be you know, always be looking. The thing that'll get you is the power lines, because they're the hardest thing to see.
Yeah.
And fortunately, here in the first world, where they are is pretty organized and predictable, you know, and as any of you have learned by flying in Colombia or Mexico, you know, it's a lot of variability to where they might be in the third world. And so, you know, always be looking for the lines, because that will be the number one thing you need to understand the location of when you've got those options, number one and number two, which is why I like the schools and the parks, because of the hazards of having them over sporting events. You kind of know that that's not where they're going to be. And so they're only going to be around the perimeter. And so there's there's sort of a building code to a school ground that's fairly reliable as far as the power lines go. So that's why they're always good options.
So I'm going to add to that and ask Jordan a question. So that was I think a good answer for someone that flies XC. What would you say to someone that's going to do their first milk run? Jordan.
It is XC.
I know, but let's say we've got a P2, we're taking them on a milk run, they're gonna make it to Olympus and they might bomb out there. Sure. So what did you do before the flight to help them?
And what is
Milk run is the most common XC flight in any given area. For us, we have a few. It's Grandview to North Side, V to North Side, Inspo to North Side, give or take. Bandwidth is a really big issue with new pilots. You're thinking about the glider, you're thinking about thermaling, you're thinking about XC decisions, you're thinking about landing. So when we're mentoring on trying to get pilots on their first milk run, you make their landing options really simple. If you make transition A to B, you have 2 landing options here and here. If you make B to C, you have 2 landing options here and here. And you map those out. You have them walk them, you have them become familiar with those beforehand. There are plenty of odd spots along Grandview to North Side that you can tuck a paraglider. But usually the best ones require a glide out to the valley at some point. So recognizing when you've got low enough that you can no longer scratch and you need to push out to that, Cottonwood Heights High School, which is the biggest green field in the city, when Houndstooth fails you. Really, it's just about knowing your no. Like for me, in cross-country flying, you're oftentimes presented with an opportunity for a desperate save to a trigger or a very reliable LZ. But if you give up that LZ and that trigger doesn't work, there are no LZs. You're forced to side hill, you're forced to top land, you're forced to stick it in a tree. For me, that is an immediate no for the low save, for the thermal, for the desperate glide. And I have missed many an XE opportunity or furthering the distance by choosing to land immediately. And my friends with a higher risk tolerance go for that desperate save and climb out immediately and continue crushing. But I'm okay with going for that perfect LZ and presented with an option of a great landing or a unknowable invariable. But know your LZs, map them out and really make sure you know them.
And so the milk run, when's the first time? 1993, I think, is the first time I flew from Olympus to the Point. And that was more popular. All right, first time I flew from Olympus to the Point was 93. And I think only 3 people had done it, Ken, John Bouchard, and myself. And since then, I've probably done that run over 100 times. And so in many of those times I didn't make, I've done the run 100 times and there's probably another 100 times where I didn't make it. And so then you have to land in various places. And I would say that with a paraglider, especially when you're doing the milk run, it's going to be north. It'll be more north the further south you get. And you could sort of name where all the LZs are. You have whatever the elementary school to basic Ranger is. Then you have Churchill Middle School, which is closer to Olympus. There's another elementary school up the hill. It's got a bunch of trees around it, but I've landed in it before, and that one's fine. There's the little scrappy LZ at the base of Olympus, which doesn't look like much, but it still works. You can put a glider in there. When you get over to the mouth of Big Cottonwood, there's the golf course. If you want a Old Mill Golf Course, which is over by Mount Olympus, if you go down on the first glide from Olympus, and when you get over to the Houndstooth, which is also called the B Hill, you can land at the very base of the hill on the trail, which is an old road that leads to Ferguson Canyon. And you'll find that wind is usually pretty cross from the north, right at the base of the B Hill. And so what looks like an improbably small landing zone, which is the road that runs along the base of the hill above the houses, which is a trail, it actually goes uphill, which is even better. You can hover it in on that road, super easy. I've done it countless times, and it's an improbable looking landing zone that in many ways is easier to hit than landing at the elementary school at the base of Ranger when it's on. And so don't think that only a giant field will do. And anything smaller of that is going to be super hard to do and only for a super skilled pilot. You could find it could be quite easy to do, like many of you side hill on the south side. You know, it's like the same thing. All you got to do is understand what the winds do. And the more wind you have, the smaller the landing zone you need. And something like that one is also free of obstacles. Now, I've landed in the baseball diamond, that's on the other side of the road at the base of that hill, and that's a hole.
Yeah.
Even though it's a baseball diamond, it's a
Oh,
friggin'
yeah.
hole to put your glider in. I'll take the Ferguson Canyon Trail any day versus that one. But it's a nice green field. It's in a hole. And so, know yourself and what you can do, and then believe in it if it's what you can do. And you do that milk run, there'll be times you'll be landing even at the mouth of this one sounds ridiculous, but it totally works. At the mouth of Little Cottonwood, like right at the mouth, there's this little park. It's got a little mound of dirt on it, a bunch of small trees, and a gravel parking lot on the south side of it, but it's a small ass little park. We've landed there countless times because it blows up the canyon every time, and you don't need to land on the grass. You can just land in the gravel parking lot. It never has any cars in it. And even though it's right next to the road and there's a lot going on there, the predictability of the wind makes nailing it way easier than you think. And so it's really important when you're landing in an unfamiliar spot is to not get overwhelmed, by the fact that it's an unfamiliar spot. Identify it as early as you can, that's where I'm going to land, and then focus on setting it up the best you can, and you'll land. Paraglider's slow moving, it's got a crappy glide ratio, it's got a low stall speed. You can land these things in a lot of places. Believe it.
When I took one of Ken's classes, an exercise he'd have us do is just as we were driving, he'd be like, all right, you need to land within 100 feet of where we are now, figure it out. And I think by practicing that on the ground a little bit, when I'm in the air, I've familiarized myself with that process, so it doesn't take quite as long.
I think that's a good thing to do. Heather, you had.
Yeah, can you guys talk about stuff you probably take for granted when you're flying, which is how to recognize hazards, especially in this environment from the air. So if you're doing a milk run, what do you think about when you're about to come to a canyon? Is there venturi, or do you see a rocky area and you're like, that's going to be real spicy? Do I avoid that? What are things you're thinking about looking at the terrain and what line you're going to pick?
I would some general rules, and that is, let's just use grandeur as the starting point. You always have to take a flight one step at a time. And so the first thing you're going to do at grandeur is, pick a good cycle to launch into, and then try to have a good climb out. And you might find a thermal right away off launch, or you might need to go looking around for one. When you do find that climb, I find the climb out of grandeur more complicated than the climb out of Olympus. And that's just because of you have a very broad face on Olympus that faces into the wind, and it's a really good thermal collector, and stuff tends to be way more obvious and organized on that. But on grandeur, with its series of ridges, it just seems to be more mysterious as to where you find the thermal. So look around, find the thermal, and climb out. And let's say you climb out. Make sure you find, one thing, especially newer thermal pilots do, is they don't find the top of the lift. And so they find a piece of the lift, and they start to get high in it. And then it was like, all right, this feels high enough, I'm leaving. But high enough is the top of the lift, not high enough. I'm getting, I'm getting nervous about being this far off the ground, because again, this is a transition we all go through leaving the point. And so I'm more comfortable not being so high. And now I'm getting really high. And so now I just want to leave. And you're just going to have to tell yourself, no, take it off. It's going to be better that way. It's going to be less scary that way. It's going to be more comfortable the more altitude you have. And if you fly the mountains enough, you're nervous when you're, it becomes the opposite at the point. Now I'm nervous when I'm near the ground, and I feel way more comfortable really high, because now I'm only going to get hurt if I hit the ground, and now I'm pretty far away from it. So this is better. But that takes time to sort of change that mindset. And so when you're new to thermaling in the mountains, you'll want to be disciplined and keep encouraging yourself to find the top of that thermal before you go in the first transition. And so the first transition will take you across Olympus Cove. And you can go across deep in the back, which puts you closer to the mouth of Mill Creek Canyon, which is a pretty narrow canyon. I've never found much of a canyon suck there, but there's always a first time. And then you're going to be around the back of Olympus Cove, which the LZs are sparse. But there is a water tank in a fenced box at the mouth of Next Canyon, and I've landed right inside that before.
It's the parking lot.
Next to the parking lot,
Yeah.
landed right inside the box and had to climb over the fence to get out. But you can make it work. You can make a lot of landing zones work. So I would recommend just going across the middle of Olympus Cove. I wouldn't go around the back.
Yeah.
And go across the middle of the cove, because you've got the Churchill School coming up, but there's also that not really used right now construction site that's across the street from the Olympus Cove shopping mall there with Barbacoa and Einstein's in it. That's quite open. So, I've never landed there in my recollection, but I've thought about it many a time. If I was going to come up short on making the Churchill Middle School. Churchill Middle School is really good, really big, great place to land, way better than Grandeur Peak School. And so you can land there. And so there's plenty of thermals on that seem to pop out of the cove. And so I would just believe you're going to get one, keep those LZs close and go right across the middle of the cove. And you get one thermal, it will just take you right over to Mount Olympus. And it'll be a good one. And if you're patient and you track that thermal all the way back to Olympus, it'll take you right over the top. If you get over 12,000 feet, you could make the glide from there to the point. Probably don't need anything else. And I wouldn't recommend what some friends of mine did during a competition, because I told them, yeah, if you get to 12 on Olympus, you can glide to the point. So they're like, okay, Belcourt said we could make it. So they get to 12 on Olympus and they go straight line to the point, which is a cross Draper and Sandy, and they make it by like 200 feet. And they're like, yeah, Bill said we could make it. We made it. And I was like, well, I was kind of thinking more like this. But I'm glad it worked out for it. So from 12,000 feet, keep the terrain within reach. You could probably fly all the way to the point, maybe depending on the glide you get, you'll probably make it. And so that's why the altitude is really good. It's like I don't even have to thermal anymore. I can just take in the sights and glide all the way there. And if I do need a little bit more, I'm not so far out in the valley that I can't move in a little bit and find a bit more. But let's just say you get the typical altitude of 9 or 10 grand on Olympus. Now you're going to cross Big Cottonwood Canyon, the sand pit, the gravel pit down there. And you're gonna go into that B hill, which has the houndstooth as the crown up on top. I always called it the 7-Eleven hill because it was the hill above the 7-Eleven. So to me, it's always the 7-Eleven. And that one is very ridge soarable, so you can come into that, sticking to the northwest corner of it because the wind will tend to wrap around that face. And if you ridge soar it like the wind is west, you sort of get out of the best part of the lift band. And it's best to stay on the northwest corner. And you can climb up to the top of the hill. You don't have to go as deep as the houndstooth. It can be a little rowdy back there. You can stay out front on the hill. And if you get over the top of the hill, you can make the next transition. So I know if I'm over the top of the hill, I'll at least make it to the toe of Little Cottonwood. But more is always better. And so from there, you get over you thermal there, you head over to Little Cottonwood Canyon. Knowing that the further south I go, the more sideways the wind will get. So the thermaling is easier. At Mount Olympus, it's easier at the houndstooth. It's even still pretty easy at the toe of Little Cottonwood. And what I mean by the toe is, there's a ridge that sticks out. It's got Bell's Canyon on the backside. It's good rock climbing back there. And then Little Cottonwood Canyon on this side. And so you just go right to the top of that ridge, again, not too deep. You don't want to get up in the canyon. And if you're on the top of the ridge, it's a bit of a convergence because of the north wind, typical afternoon valley flow, and then the heating of Bell's Canyon, because there's a lot of rock back there. So it makes a little convergence over the top. Usually, if you're ridge soaring over the top of that, if you're patient, you get a big thermal there, and that will drift towards Lone Peak. But if you just blow past that and you're getting kind of low, the wind will be more sideways the further south towards the point you are, and you might find that the thermals are now kind of shredded and it's not sweet. The last really good thermal you usually get is that one at the toe of Little Cotton. And then you got to be a little deeper on Lone Peak to get the next one. But there's a park down the end of Lone Peak. That's a really good barrel at LZ. I've landed in that plenty of times, Hidden Valley. And then if I've landed at the mouth of Little Cottonwood, there's the one I described that's right across the street from Wasatch Boulevard and where Little Cottonwood Canyon Road meet. And just south of that is a few scrappy options. But I would say that don't leave the toe of Little Cottonwood low. Try to get something there. And then it's a matter of going, okay, there's on Lone Peak, if you don't climb super high on it, there's the last couple of spiky rocks before you start getting towards the gap, where the golf course is for your final glide to the point. If you're above those spiky rocks, you probably make it, even if it doesn't look like you will. Because once you get into the gap towards Potato Hill and whatnot, it can get pretty lefty. It'll be sinky at first because you've got a Venturi that is right around that where the first part of the golf course is, and it'll be really sinky, and you'll go, God, I'm not going to make it, and then it will get good again. And then, I've ridge soared Potato Hill, desperate, just get to the top of Potato Hill, and if I got to the top of Potato Hill, I knew I could make it to the end of the upper bench, but there's a lot more houses there than there was before. And so squeaking into the upper bench, flying ridge soaring in the backyards is probably like not as good as sweet as it once was. So I would recommend not trying to squeak it in. Again, it's that discipline of getting altitude. Even if you find it a little scary, that will make the flight go way easier. And so it's typically 4 or 5 thumbs. That's all you got to do.
And that last piece, you'll get to practice in the point route series a lot. Fly with the tempo, fly with the data bill a lot.
Yeah, and that's
We'll do that piece. You do that before you even attempt to go on the milk run. You can finish, you can see at the end is the work rate.
yeah, and that's a great suggestion because if you got a lot of confidence in the last piece of the flight, because that piece inside and out, you'll come off Lone Peak and you'll just be in your backyard going, oh, I can get there. I know I have enough because I've been out here before with less on the point route series. And I know every spot. And so a lot of these flights are pieces of a puzzle, and like I said, I've been doing this a long time. So, 93, I'm flying from Olympus to the point. And then, we're flying from Inspo to the point. If it's south, that's 18 miles straight line. It's 14 miles from Olympus to the point. It's 16 miles from, these are straight line distance, from Grandeur to the point. It's 30 miles on the dot from the V to the point. I could just recite these things because I've done them so many times. And so you start going, okay, I've got Olympus to the point. All right, I've got Grandeur to the point. Okay, I've got the V to Grandeur. And so if I've got the V to Grandeur, I can do the V to the point. And it's like, okay, I've got Grandeur to the Inspo LZ. And now I've got Inspo to Spanish Fork. I've done that one, a few times. And so then that turns into, it's like, okay, I'm flying Inspo to Nephi, down through Payson, Elk Ridge. I figured out that. And so then pretty soon it's the V to Nephi, because you've done all the sections. Now it's just going, okay, I've done all the sections. I'm familiar with how to do every piece of it. Now I'm just going to put them all together. It's still flying the Wasatch front, know it inside and out. You're not going over the back. You're not going in deep. You're just flying the Wasatch front, and you've flown all these sections, and now you're just doing all the sections.
Yeah, and I think we're gonna wrap it up on that note because we got about 5 minutes left, but
We have a couple questions.
we do have a couple questions. I wanted to mention that the last comment ties back into minimizing the jumps that we're making. And that's going to be the theme that we continue to talk about in all the clinics, is minimizing the jumps. Like when you're moving from the point and you fly at 5 p.m. at Northside, you don't go to Grandeur and fly at 3 p.m. And when you're learning your first milk run thing, you're probably just going to go to Olympus and land there. So we're always minimizing our gaps. I know we do have a few more questions, but we have 5 minutes left and we have a raffle to do as well. So
You got to take.
all right, who's got the questions? Sure.
You're talking about flying the south side in the afternoon, and it's kind of precursor to mountain flight.
I didn't say afternoon. I said light conditions.
Side on the.
Yeah, north side on an afternoon. Yeah, south side on the afternoon would probably be prefrontal. Otherwise it'd be north, or it'd be winter time, and you could probably do it in the afternoon. But if it's prefrontal on the south side in the afternoon, it could be strong.
That might be worse than flying the mountains.
Yeah.
North side in the afternoon, you're not about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so north side in the afternoon, but if you're looking for a challenge, is everybody who is not familiar with the convergence?
Local convergence here?
Yeah, the north south.
Diurnal.
Probably most.
All right, so, this might have just disappeared with the time. And that is, in the morning or the first part of the day, it blows south, you know, and the theory is, which is a theory, is that it's the influence of the Great Salt Lake. You know, it's a offshore and an onshore wind that from the Great Salt Lake that is causing the north and the south flow. So in the morning it blows south, that's the offshore winds because the land hasn't heated up yet. And in the afternoon, when the land heats up, it's an onshore from the Great Salt Lake that causes the north wind. And so at some point in the middle of the day, you have the switch. It's going from south to north. And that means that the onshore is being pushed down the valley, coming off the Great Salt Lake, and it's meeting the south wind at some point, pushing it back until the north makes it to the point. And so you have people on the north side going, it's north at the airport, it's coming down here. And so while it's coming down there, it's colliding with the south wind and it's making a convergence. That is what a convergence is, you know, winds of opposite directions, you know, coming together and creating a line of lift. And so that line of lift will move down the valley and make it to the point. And if your timing is just right, we used to chase this thing like it was the unicorn. You could be flying the south side and be in the air at the right moment when it switches north. And so you can get into the convergence. You can get into it quite low, 50 feet off the south side. Suddenly you're just in the right spot at the right moment, and you can climb out to 13,000 feet over the south side in the convergence. And so it's magic to nail the convergence. You know, when I was into chasing it down, I nailed it 4 times. But since I don't fly the point anymore, I don't try anymore. But that you want to really experience mountain flying at the point. See if you can get the convergence starting at the south side, or on a light and variable wind day, before the valley wind makes it to the north side, there'll be thermal cycles coming in the north side with very little wind. And so those are pure thermal cycles with no ridge lift. And you might sink out a bunch trying to get one of those thermals, but it's great mountain practice at the point to try to thermal the north side.
May I have your attention, please? The library will be closing in 30 minutes at 6 o'clock. If you need to get a library card, pay a fine. Please go to the checkout desk immediately.
At least you're not kicking us out. So launching the north side early before the ridge lift is helping you stay up is a good way to practice thermal.
Yeah. I have one thing to add real quick since we're at the end on that note. If you're a P2 or P3 pilot and thermaling or XC decision making is something that is just really insurmountable for you, I or any of my colleagues would be happy to take you for a tandem in the mountains. I was taken on a tandem from Inspo to Cottonwood Heights by Rosh when I was a P2. We hit 14,000 feet and he taught me the whole thing from start to finish. And I have offered that to people in Cove and Monroe, which is a great site for it. A little trickier in the Wasatch, but certainly possible. So if you really want to learn, possibly consider reaching out to tandem pilots and see if they'll take you out. It's really great to feel that, see that, take the breaks yourself. Hear our decision making in the moment. You'll learn a ton in a compressed amount of time.
Yeah, so that's going to be
One warning before you talk, and wraps it up. So if you're chasing the convergence at the point, light wind days.
yeah.
If it's a strong, you know, if the north and the south are battling for dominance and it's a strong switch, it'll be really rough getting into that convergence. And so LNV days is the only days.
Yeah.
What time of day are you talking about?
Hands on.
Starting on the south side, right?
Yeah, it's like the south side, you know, you're
supposed to.
No,
Yeah.
it's your ridge soar in the south side, right when the switch is happening. It's gotta be during the switch, so it's the afternoon.
So guys, on that note, we're gonna adjourn this. I wanted to add that we're gonna be having a weather clinic coming up, a reserve clinic in 2 weeks, I think.
Mhm.
April 8th,
April
I
8th,
think.
Yeah, possibly April 8th and 9th. And
Yeah.
we have to come out about that to save the date. There are no signups yet.
Yeah, and then we'll have a kiting clinic at Southside, Brian Peterson and a couple others that Andrew Ross is hosting. And we'll-
Site intros.
Yep, and then we'll be doing a woofer with Jordan and Mountain Site. What's that?
I'm organizing.
Yep, yeah, he's organizing, not instructing. And then Mr. Jock right here is gonna be doing mountainside intros. And if you're interested in any of those things, please give us your information or email Heather
Yes.
at that, because we wanna get you in the groups. Like, they're gonna be in telegrams, and a lot of times people say, oh, I never even heard of this. And we just wanna make sure you're in the group. Also on that note, please sign up for Ooga Pooga, pay your dues, because it's what's funding this. Like, I wouldn't have been able to pay $950 out of my pocket for the equipment for the reserve toss clinic. And if you don't pay your dues, then the few of us that do are gonna be paying a lot more. So, on that note, we have a little raffle, and I'll let Heather take it away.
Can I start with some thank yous first? Thank you all for showing up and honoring